The human skeleton is an essential part of the human body. It makes up about 20% of the body's mass. Functionally, the skeleton does a lot for us. It supports the weight of the body and provides its structural framework. It supports the head and neck and provides protection for the most critical organs in our bodies, like the heart, the lungs, and the brain. It's a storehouse for minerals like calcium and phosphorus, and it stores fat too. The skeleton also provides movement for our bodies by giving a point of attachment and leverage for our muscles. The bone marrow inside of our skeleton houses stem cells that make our red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets. Now, something to keep in mind about the skeleton is that although it looks like a static tissue, it doesn't seem like it changes much. In actuality, it's dynamic. It adjusts and changes according to the stresses placed on the human body. For example, when a woman carries a child or children, their skeleton changes to accommodate the new life growing inside of her. When someone starts working out or takes up a new job lifting heavy boxes, their skeleton adjusts to the new physical demands placed on the body. The skeleton is an important part of any body. In this chapter, we'll learn about how the bones of the skeleton kind of fit together, and we'll learn about what they are, what their names are. Your objective for this video is to state the functions of the skeleton, which I just talked about on the last slide. You should also be able to name the major divisions of the skeleton and name the 8 cranial bones of the skull. The skeletal system, or the skeleton, is composed mostly of bone, but you should be aware that there's cartilage in isolated areas, and you also have connective tissues called ligaments that connect the bones to each other and reinforce the joints. Where bones come together, you have joints, which are also called articulations. The skeleton is divided into 2 major divisions: the axial skeleton, which you see here in green, and the appendicular skeleton, which you see in the kind of off-white color. Notice that the appendicular skeleton consists of all of the bones that compose the limbs, so that's the arms and the legs, as well as the bones that connect the limbs to the axial skeleton. So we're talking about things like the clavicle here, and the scapula, and the pelvic bones. So all of that is appendicular. The axial skeleton consists of the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. Again, the parts that are in green. The functions of this part of the skeleton are that they form the long axis of the body. These bones support the head, neck, and trunk, and they protect the brain, the spinal cord, and the thoracic organs. In this video and our next video, we're going to focus on the skull. The skull is the most complex bony structure in the body. It's formed by 2 sets of bones. The first set of bones are called the cranial bones, and they form the cranial vault. The cranial vault houses the brain. The main function of the cranial bones is to protect the brain and to provide sites of attachment for head and neck muscles. The other portion of the skull is the facial bones. The facial bones help to secure the teeth. They anchor the facial muscles to provide movement so that we can make expressions with our faces. And they also help protect. They make cavities that contain our special organs, things like our eyes, our tongue, and the nasal cavity as well. These facial bones provide openings for air and food passage into the human body. Now let's look at the bones that form the cranial vault. The cranial vault is made up of 8 distinct bones. The first bone, located here, is the frontal bone. This is a flat, shell-shaped bone that forms the anterior skull and protects portions of the frontal lobe of the brain. This region, which you may associate with the forehead, is called the squamosal region. Inferior to the squamosal region, there are 2 thick ridges of thickened bone. These are called the supraorbital margins, and they typically have either a small hole or a small divot in them, which is not shown here. This is the supraorbital foramen in the case of the hole, and the supraorbital notch in the case of the divot. Both of these markings allow nervous tissue or nerves to pass from one side of the skull to the other. This area between the orbits is called the glabella. Lateral to the glabella, you have the frontal sinuses. Now you can't see them on this image because they're actually inside the bone. Sinuses are air pockets or cavities. They help sounds resonate throughout the skull, and they also make the bones of the skull less dense. These cavities are lined with mucous membranes, and when that mucous membrane becomes irritated because of exposure to chemicals or allergens, or maybe because of infectious microorganisms like viruses or bacteria, the membranes produce lots and lots of mucus, and that mucus begins to fill the holes in the sinus. This creates painful sinus pressure. Have you ever had a sinus headache? The type where you feel pain right here in the front of your head, or maybe around your eyes? Now you know what causes that. It's mucus filling up the sinuses. Posterior to the frontal bone, we have a pair of parietal bones, a left parietal bone and a right parietal bone. The parietal bones form a joint with the frontal bone right here. This is called a suture. Sutures are immovable joints. There are small protein fibers in the joint that help hold the bones together, making movement across this joint almost impossible. This particular suture is called the coronal suture, after the coronal plane. You'll recall from chapter 1, the coronal plane divides body parts and the entire body into anterior and posterior regions. What helps me remember the coronal plane is that corona refers to crown or crowns, and this particular suture looks a little bit like the way a tiara would fit on the head. The parietal bones also form a joint right here. This is called the sagittal suture. Remember, sagittal planes divide the body into left and right regions, so this suture separates the left and the right parietal bones. Inferior to the parietal bones is another important bone called the temporal bone, and there are 2 of these, one on each side of the skull. The temporal bone protects the temporal lobes from harm and damage. Some of the markings that you should know for the temporal bone include this. This large bony projection, let me move the skull a little bit so you can see it better. This large bony projection is called the mastoid process, and it's an anchor point for head and neck muscles. Medial to the mastoid process is this sharp, spiky projection here. This is called the styloid process. It looks a little bit like a stylus or pen.
that you might use to draw on a computer screen. The styloid process anchors tongue and neck muscles. This projection is called the zygomatic process, and it forms part of the cheek. The final marking that you should be aware of is this little hole right here. This is called the external auditory meatus, or sometimes the external acoustic meatus. If we had muscle and skin on this skull, what you'd see is that the ear sits right here. And you know how there's the ear canal that connects the inside of the ear to the outside of the body? Well, this is part of the ear canal. So you would have the external parts of the ear that help funnel sounds into the ear canal. Then the ear canal passes through here, the external auditory meatus, and a little deeper inside of the skull you would have a thin membrane called the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum. When sound comes into the ear canal, it makes the tympanic membrane vibrate back and forth, and then that vibration is transmitted to a set of small bones inside of the skull called the ossicles. And it's the ossicles that actually convert that vibration into more vibration that stimulates other parts of the inner ear, and those other parts of the inner ear will actually turn that into electrical impulses that the brain can interpret for the sound. So you just need to know the external auditory meatus, and the rest of that about how hearing works you'll learn in AMP2. The temporal bone articulates with the parietal bones through the squamosal suture, which runs along here. Our next bone is the occipital bone. The occipital bone forms the posterior portion of the skull, and it articulates with the parietal bones through a very special suture called the lambdoid suture. The lambdoid suture is this V-shaped suture that you see right here. It gets its name because it looks like the Greek letter lambda, especially when you connect it to the sagittal suture here. A couple of markings that you need to know for the occipital bone are this hole right here. This is called the foramen magnum. It is a large hole that allows the spinal cord to connect to the brain. The way that the nervous system works is that special organs called nerves in your body detect stimuli, things that are happening, changes that are happening around and in your body. They convert that information into electrical impulses that travel through the spinal cord up to the brain. The brain may interpret those electrical impulses, decide how to respond to the stimulus, and send another electrical impulse down the spinal cord and back out to the nerves. So the spinal cord, which passes through here, connects the nerves to the brain so that that communication can happen. So in order to get to the brain, you've got to go through the foramen magnum. Lateral to the foramen magnum, you have two bumps. These are called the occipital condyles, and they form a joint with the first vertebra of your bony spine. So far, we've only talked about 6 out of the 8 bones of the skull. Let's look at the remaining 2. The sphenoid bone is a bat-shaped bone that goes from the left side of the skull to the right side. This bone is called a keystone bone because it articulates with all of the other bones of the cranial vault. It articulates with the frontal bone here, the parietal bone here, the temporal bone here. It also articulates inferiorly with the occipital bone here. The last bone of the skull that we've not looked at so far is the ethmoid. And the ethmoid is located here. So the sphenoid also articulates with the ethmoid right through here. A couple of bone markings that you need to know for the sphenoid are shown in this image. Do you see this saddle-like structure here? This is called the Turkish saddle, or the sella turcica. It's also sometimes called the hypophyseal seat. The hypophysis is another name for the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is the master gland that controls many functions, including metabolism in the body. It also controls the activity of various glands. So, for example, when human beings undergo puberty, it's the pituitary gland that orchestrates all of the hormonal changes and the physical changes that accompany that body stage. The pituitary is located on the inferior aspect of the brain. It's suspended from a stalk called the infundibulum, and it nestles very nicely right here in the Turkish saddle. Another bone marking that you should know are these two canals just anterior to the sella turcica. These are passageways that the optic nerves use to bring sensory information from the eyes to the brain. Let me put the rest of the bones here so that perhaps you can see what I mean. So the orbits, the eyes, would be here. And then you can kind of see the optic canal right here. So the optic nerve would be attached to the back of the eyeball. Then it would pass through the sphenoid here to get to the brain. And this is what helps us to see. The final bone is the ethmoid, which you can see here. If I rotate the skull a bit, what you'll see is that there is a bit of bone that extends down into the nasal cavity. This bit of bone is called the cribriform plate, and it helps to form the superior portion of the nasal cavity as well as the nasal septum. You also have some bony masses here that form the nasal conchae. So the nasal conchae, or the turbinates, are bony processes that distort the walls of the nasal cavity so that when you inhale air, the air gets whipped around up here around the conchae and it becomes turbulent or disturbed. This allows any dust, debris, or matter that might be in the air that you're breathing, it allows it to stick to the mucous membranes along the respiratory tract so that that material can be removed before the air actually gets to your lungs. Another structure of the ethmoid that I would like for you to see is this one. This is called the crista galli, or the rooster's comb, because it kind of stands up from the rest of the bone, the same way that a rooster's comb would do. This is an attachment point for the meninges, the membranes that surround the brain. This attachment point helps to anchor the brain into the skull so that it doesn't jostle around and become dislodged. So you can see here how it projects up into the cranial cavity. So those are the bones of the cranial vault. You do need to know these for your lab practical, as well as the bone markings that I've mentioned in these videos and the bone markings that are on your lab practical review sheet.
Before I end this video, I just want you to know that the cranium is divided into the vault and the base. So the vault forms the superior, the lateral, and the posterior portion of the skull, as well as the forehead, and the base forms the inferior aspect of the skull. Internally, the base is divided into 3 steps, or they're also called fossae. So F-O-S-S-A-E. You have the anterior fossa here, which is formed by the frontal bone, as well as the sphenoid and the ethmoid bone. You have the middle fossa here, which in part is formed by the sphenoid and the occipital. And then you have the posterior cranial fossa, which is formed primarily by the occipital bone. The brain sits within these fossa and is enclosed by the cranial vault. The area inside of all of this is called the cranial cavity. In addition to the cranial cavity, the cranium has other cavities. So you have the middle and internal ear cavities, which I don't think are shown here. You have the nasal cavities, which you're familiar with. They're going to be in here. You have the orbits, which hold the eyes. Okay, and you have the oral cavity here as well. Oh, that's kind of a scary face. Let me get rid of that. Looks a little bit like Edvard Munch's The Scream. The skull has 85 named openings. They're going to be called foramina, which are basically like holes, like this one here. Or you saw the foramen magnum down here. You have canals, like this one. And then you have fissures, and fissures are kind of very small slit-like openings that you find in some bones. All of these provide passageways for either the spinal cord, major blood vessels, and your cranial nerves. So that's it for the cranium portion of the skull. You need to be able to recognize the bones of the cranium as well as the different markings. That's the bulges and holes and things that I talked about. You need that for your lab practical. The reason why we're spending so much time learning the parts of the skeleton and the bone markings is because it's easier to understand the functions of the skeleton when you understand the structure of the skeleton. In the next video, we're going to focus on the facial bones, and as part of that video, there's also an introduction to joints. We'll talk a bit more about joints in another chapter, but in that video, I do talk a little bit about the joints as related to the ones in the skull. So I'll see you at that video. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to reach out by text or email. I'm here to answer any questions that you might have. Until the next video, bye!